Pastor Matt said, apologetics is defending your faith, and last week I ended, 2 weeks ago, with asking you guys to give me questions that your friends might be asking you, or that you might want to know about your faith. And so I selected a few things to go over tonight, mostly about Jesus, his resurrection, which was one of our main Christian beliefs that Jesus resurrected from the dead after being hung on the cross. Jesus' body, what happened to it? One of the arguments atheists sometimes use is, what if the disciples stole Jesus' body? It is possible that they did. Could Jesus have faked his death? Also is another one that I have heard before in my life. Resurrected or revived? One argument from non-Christians is that Jesus never died on the cross. He was just knocked out from the exhaustion and he revived later. Some of the arguments about this include, the Bible says Jesus was offered some liquid from a sponge while on the cross, more specifically vinegar. What if the liquid was drugged? Jesus might have just been heavily sedated. The Bible also says Pilate was surprised at how fast Jesus died, Mark 15:44. Perhaps he was taken off the cross too early, before he was really dead. Just fainted. This theory could explain how Jesus was able to simply walk out of the tomb after being revived by the wet and darkness of the tomb after 3 days. First, I want to look over how the cross worked, how it actually killed people. Thieves were usually put on the cross, or people that murdered, basically any criminals, and the Romans used it as their crucifixion. After being flogged by Roman soldiers, they led Jesus to the place where he was being crucified, which is Golgotha, or a place called the Skull. They then laid him down and nailed his wrist to the board, slicing through the large nerve that runs through to the hand. Imagine the feeling of squeezing the nerve in your funny bone with pliers. Now, you might have been hit in the funny bone before. I was hit in the funny bone once when I was at Avon Creek. A kid threw a rock at me and hit me there, and I couldn't move it for 2 hours. And I just imagine that pliers, that would really hurt. Then after nailing the wrist to the horizontal beam, they would attach it to the vertical beam and raise his body. Then they would nail the feet to the cross, severing the nerve there. So double pliers squeezing to the nerves, kind of thing. Immediately, Jesus' arms would have been stretched by the weight coming from his body hanging on them, pulling his arms about 6 inches longer, and both soldiers would be dislocated. Continue. The severe nerves and dislocated joints don't necessarily kill a person. The real reason the cross was so effective was the difficulty to breathe while hanging. Jesus would have had to push up on his feet in order to exhale. After exhaling, he would sag down again. This would continue until complete exhaustion would take over, and Jesus would not have been able to have the strength to breathe. As his breathing slowed down, he would have had an erratic heartbeat and eventually cardiac arrest, ending in death from suffocation. Along with one of the soldiers stabbing Jesus in the side with a spear, John 19:34, and the flogging, it is unlikely Jesus or any person could fake death under these circumstances, even with drugs. But suppose Jesus did survive the cross through some miraculous event. Suppose he was able to escape from the burial wrapping, able to roll away the stone covering the tomb, and able to get past the Roman guards. What would the message of the resurrection be like today? Would Jesus' disciples have been filled with awe? Would they have been inspired to carry this message of the resurrection that we have today through persecution, being beaten, stoned, and tortured? Most likely they would have not been. It just would not be worth it to them, and Jesus would not have been the real Messiah if he was not resurrected. The disciples went through a lot of torture and pain, and a lot of their deaths were very difficult. Peter was actually hung on the cross upside down, and that's the way he died. So imagine the blood rushing to his head, and also with the breathing difficulties and then the severe nerves and everything. I don't really think that anyone would continue with a lie just to prove that they're right and go to death to prove that they're correct. They must be severely stubborn if they do. So then, what happened to the body? Since Jesus didn't die down on the cross, then what about the resurrection? Did thieves steal the body? Was the story just made up? Was it made up? Quite simply, the story couldn't have been made up if there was no body found. If the story was made up, Roman officials at the time would have reported the hoax. They would have shown the body and cut the crowd because they did not like it at all. But once again, why would the disciples want to make the story up in the first place? Perhaps to make themselves not look so foolish for following Jesus around. But nobody would be foolish enough to make up the resurrection story and stick with it to their death. The disciples believed with their whole heart that Jesus was risen. They were persecuted and put to death for preaching such a thing. If they made it up, they would have most likely been worried about their own hide rather than dying to not look foolish. Thieves. If the body was missing, then it must have been the disciples who stole it. Did the disciples have a motive to steal the body, though? On the surface, they did. The Gospels reported the disciples were scared and disillusioned after Jesus' death. Some even renounced the faith, and the others hid in fear behind locked doors. These were not the best candidates for a robbery. But what if there were others? If they wanted to spread the story that Jesus had been raised to life, then they would have needed to get rid of the evidence he wasn't. Now all the thieves would need is an opportunity. The tomb was like a small room cut out of the rock and the entrance covered with a large stone guarded by Roman soldiers. The entrance was low to the ground and there was a slanted groove that led down to it. The disc-shaped stone could easily be rolled down, but gravitational force would make it so severe so several strong people would have to lift it to get it out of place. The Gospel of Matthew agrees with this archaeological description, and the Gospel tells us more about it as well. The tomb was also sealed with a cord, making it more trouble to break in. Authorities would wrap a rope across the entrance, and they would cover each end with clay or melted wax to keep it on. It is possible that the cord could contain an official imprint of the Roman Empire, so anyone who broke the seal was breaking the law. Now, all the disciples would need is for the guards to fall asleep. There were most likely enough of them they could move the stone. The Bible does say that the guards were found asleep, but the disciples would not have been expecting this. Roman guards falling asleep was a rarity. Guards were trained under strict orders and could be severely punished if found asleep. Also, if the disciples did find the soldiers asleep, then the noise of rolling away the stone would have woken them up. The entire tomb was on lockdown and could not be entered. It was rendered almost impossible, and most disciples were too afraid to try and steal the body anyways. To see what really happened, read the last few chapters of any of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John.